All right, and we're live on Energy Superheroes today with Alexa St. John, and she's a reporter with Business Insider. Alexa's based in the Detroit area. Today, we're going to talk about mobility startups, EVs, venture capital, and what's on the horizon that not everybody's talking about as it relates to all those areas. Alexa, we really appreciate you being on today.
Thanks for having me. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. So before we dive in too deep, you got to tell me, what is it like being a reporter in this world of startups, EVs, energy transition?
Very interesting time to say the least. So, I've been at Insider on the transportation desk, covering autos and, of course, focusing on EVs since about July 2021. And before that, I spent a couple of years reporting for automotive news, also on the mobility space. And really, just in that time frame, we've seen such a dramatic shift. So, we've had a lot of hype, a lot of excitement around mobility startups, especially in the EV landscape recently. Now we're starting to see some realism creep in as these startups experience a lot of production, manufacturing challenges. Of course, cash challenges cannot be understated right now. There's a talent war going on. There's supply chain constraints. There's all of these things impacting the EV startups right now. And of course, we can't forget the charging folks and the battery folks as well. That's all to say there's a lot to keep track of on this beat.
No, it sounds like it. That's a lot to unpack, but let's start with finance. That's the area that I think our audience really loves. How have you seen the shift between, as you said, let's say 2020, 2021? There's a bit more hype, and today, and how has that impacted startups in the sector?
I think it's a great question. And I think most folks know back a couple of years ago, the EV startups, they got a lot of money, big, ambitious plans coming from them as it relates to manufacturing, getting a certain thousand number of vehicles out on the road, very short timeline, short development cycles. And people were really excited. People rallied behind the likes of Rivian, Lucid, other major companies, whether it was through IPOs or these SPAC deals. And you fast forward a couple of years after some of these companies have been able to get started with production, of course, start getting cars off assembly lines. And some reality is setting in, as I mentioned earlier. We're seeing how expensive it really is to get a brand new product off the line for brand new companies, some of them with brand new manufacturing plants. This is not an inexpensive venture by any means. Of course, we've seen that from the legacy OEMs as well, but these EV startups more and more are realizing just how capital intensive it is to make their flagship ship products, to get them in the hands of customers, servicing them while they're doing this direct to consumer model. It's very expensive these days, and I don't expect any of that to change anytime soon. It's tough, it's challenging, it's weighing on a lot of the startup. We've seen companies like Faraday Future really struggle. Others, again, like Rivian or Lucid, they do have quite a bit of cash on hand, but again, their spend each quarter is pretty substantial.
Yeah, it's interesting. What do you think is going to be the exit for some of these types of startups? Do you see maybe some of the legacy OEMs thinking about acquisitions, or do you think the startups are going to have to stay in it and go it alone for the long haul?
I really think it's a company by company basis, unfortunately. And I don't think it's too early to say exactly, but this is a very unpredictable landscape, right? Again, for those like Rivian, Lucid, there's still quite a bit of money in the bank, some substantial backers for each of those plays. Those companies may fare better than others, again, like a Faraday Future or an Arrival, who have made it very clear they are struggling under the financial pressures. I don't think we can discount the possibility of M&A. I've been hearing that from industry experts for a couple of years, more so in the charging space, but I don't think it's impossible for vehicle manufacturing. These startups do have some very good talent under their belt. They've had to fight for that talent, either pull from the legacy automakers, pull from Silicon Valley, but they do have that going for them. They do have a lot of resources poured into manufacturing, of course. Rivian's plant in Illinois, Lucid's whole setup in Arizona, etc. Those are great resources potentially to snatch up. And of course, the vehicle, the product lines, huge assets, but IP too has been a conversation. I don't think it's impossible, but I think maybe we won't see that shake out just yet. I think we'll still see them struggling, at least for those startups very low on cash.
No, and given that fact, it seems like they're going to have to raise more rounds of venture capital. What venture capitalists are still making investments in the sector?
So, even with the economic environment that we're looking at right now, most VCs that I've spoken with are still looking for opportunities. I will say, I think they're being a lot more selective in the mobility space, given this trend that you mentioned at the start of this momentum a couple of years ago to now and the differences there. So, they are still looking. I think most of them aren't necessarily seeking out hardware type opportunities, though. So, I think they're looking more in the software plays, perhaps more in the battery supply chain, things that seem a little bit safer or more sustainable long term than perhaps these brand new EV vehicle manufacturing startups. I think if you're not in the game yet, it's going to be very difficult for you to enter the space as a new vehicle manufacturer. So I think the VCs are seeking out opportunities elsewhere and being a lot more cautious, diligent, of course, and very selective.
And no, that makes sense. What startups are in the space, maybe in the software space that are not necessarily hardware that you've seen out there that look interesting to you?
I would say startups that are focusing on charging data are probably in a good position, first and foremost. We know, of course, the US in particular really needs to build out its charging infrastructure that has been discussed for some time, but now we're at a point with adoption of these vehicles that it's imperative. So I think it's less those hardware companies that actually do the installation, managing the standing station that you plug in at, and more so companies that can utilize data and leverage that to decide where makes the most sense for a charging station to be put, how many plugs may be in a particular area. Let's weigh geographic factors, income factors, perhaps accessibility factors. Let's pull together a lot of different types of data and figure out where makes the most sense to install these things moving forward. So, companies that are helpful on the strategic front, being a little bit more proactive, not just, oh, let's drop a charging station here, but thinking more thoughtfully about that. I think those companies are positioned very well. And then on the battery side, I would say startups that are in the mining exploration space and also those who potentially can help onshore more of the battery supply chain. Those are really the categories of companies that I'm.
No, interesting. You mentioned supply chain. That's an area that we see a lot of in all different industries, just a massive trend of onshoring. Where first, so when it comes to batteries, how can we onshore the supply chain? Where would we go about doing that in the US?
That's a big question. And I think, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act is spurring a lot of momentum around that conversation as well. I would say it's going to be tough for the US to really be able to onshore everything that it has depended on sources abroad for, especially as it relates to the EV transition. Battery is, I think it's just number one, but it takes years to set these things up. It takes years to seek out these sites of lithium, for instance, and then go through the permitting and construction process. I know there are folks lobbying to help try to expedite those processes to be able to tap into these resources much faster. But then you have, the process of cell processing and battery manufacturing. Even if we do have the resources of, say, lithium in the US, we've still largely relied on sources in China to do the processing and manufacturing. So bringing that here, that's going to require so much investment. We have seen quite a bit of that already from automakers, from their partners, joint ventures, lots of exciting things going on, but it's also a new talent base entirely. And you may not be able to just directly pull, say, internal combustion vehicle workers to the battery space. So that's a challenge. And then, of course, to that time point I mentioned earlier, getting a new mine up and running take 5, 7, 10 years. Then by the time it makes its way into a vehicle, that's how long. That's a lot of the challenges, of course, but I think it will really take, of course, an investment, that federal encouragement, that momentum there, and certainly the automakers and their suppliers sort of teaming up. It's really a lot of stakeholders need to get together to make this happen here. And certainly won't be easy or inexpensive.
No, for sure. And that is a big challenge. Supply chain, of course, infrastructure, manufacturing. What are some of the other challenges and how can they be overcome?
So, some of the challenges I think I've seen as it relates to the EV startups, for example, those that have really started production of their flagship vehicles over in the past year and a half, almost 2 years now. It's just not as easy to build a car as maybe some of them might have anticipated. Of course, the legacy automakers have their challenges as well. But what the EV startups are experiencing is a few disadvantages, one of them being just supply chain relationships. It's very difficult for an EV startup to compete with the supplier relationships that a legacy automaker might have. If I'm a supplier and I'm thinking, who do I work with? This new company, not sure if I'm going to get paid, scale's not all that much, or this legacy company that I've known for decades that I know will pay me, that I know has volume. Uh, that has really been tricky for the startups. I mentioned talent earlier, of course. There is this war not only between Silicon Valley and these EV startups, but now the legacy companies, as they continue to electrify, they're fighting for that same exact talent. Other things I think Wall Street faith is waning a little bit in the startups. We saw nearly 80% drops or so in stocks for many of the EV startups in 2022. Some of that may be shifting, course, some of that related to the broader economic environment, but still, all of this kind of contributes. And then with each quarter that a startup might not meet their expectations or their targeted production guidances, that's also tricky. Morale is tough at some of these companies. And we saw some layoffs and such, executive turnover. All of those are things that contribute to the tough times that the EV startups have. On the battery side, it's a capacity thing. It's a lot of folks say we do have enough of the lithium resources on the planet to accommodate this EV transition. But again, it's a matter of tapping into those resources, setting up the mining, getting those into EV batteries. There's a whole process in there that really stands in the way.
Yeah, this certainly makes sense. It's always challenging for startups, and even more so when you're trying to make a physical product and compete against legacy companies that are so entrenched. So, of the legacy companies, which legacy companies do you see really at the forefront, and which ones maybe are a little bit more challenged?
Sure. Certainly, Ford and GM have been very vocal over the past several years. And again, that those two in particular can really leverage those existing supplier relationships that they have, their existing manufacturing know-how, just their clout, for lack of a better word. And of course, lots and lots of resources that the EV startups just don't have yet. I'd say those two stand out. I think it will trickle down to the product that these automakers and others in the legacy space offer. We really need product on the EV side that consumers want. And I don't think it's very expensive luxury electric sedans. I don't know if it's $100,000 plus trucks even. We need to start getting down to that product, the SUVs or the crossovers at an affordable price point. Even with Ford and GM very vocal, that's still something I think that's on the back of their mind. Other companies that are challenged, I think it's important to bring up Toyota. The company until just a few days ago was very, very vocal about maybe not putting the brakes on EV, but taking a more realistic approach to EV adoption, looking at hybrids more. And that didn't fare so well for the company. They got a lot of heat for saying that in recent times. Now we're seeing this executive change, and perhaps that will play a role. And of course, Toyota sales broadly haven't really suffered all that much, even with those comments about being more realistic about the EV transition, but perhaps overcoming some of that heat will be tough for them.
Yeah, they got so much publicity over the comments, and now they have a new CEO, I guess, and he's made some comments, and so it's interesting to see. I'm glad to hear you say Ford and GM are doing well. I have to ask you, do you drive an EV?
I do not drive one yet. No. And I'll be honest, here in suburban Detroit, public charging infrastructure is not quite where it needs to be yet. I'm sure a lot of folks here in this particular area rely on their home charging. The affordability point has really stuck out to me personally. I'd love to drive one. But you look at, I think it's Kelly Blue Book data, the average cost of one was about 60, 65 or so in December. It's pretty expensive. Of course, there are more affordable options when you combine that price point and the charging infrastructure. Admittedly, it would be a little bit challenging. Hoping to make that push in the next couple of years.
I don't drive an EV either. Yeah, I like my Jeep, runs really well. And I just got a new one, and I looked at the cost of EVs, and they make a nice it's Jeep Wrangler. They make an electric Jeep Wrangler. But yeah, the challenges with charging infrastructure and the additional cost premium, I just felt wasn't quite worth.
And it's interesting. It's again, you see these companies moving towards the products that we're looking for. So that's a huge step. But affordability, I think, needs to be a priority. And now we are starting to see the automakers play more of a role in the charging side of things. I think they're realizing they can't just kick the can of responsibility down the road and third party charging companies to handle all of that for them. GM's starting to have a hand through its dealers, its network there. That's a strategic move. Mercedes, of course, announced relatively recently its plans to get into charging. I don't think anything will compare to the Tesla supercharging network, for example, anytime soon. Um, but we're starting to see them realize how significant that is. And I'll tell you, I speak with EV owners all the time, especially owners of some of the startup vehicles. And when I ask them what they think about the vehicle, some of them will say it's great, or some of them will say this just doesn't work for me. And I'll ask why. And they say there's nowhere for me to charge it. And so folks immediately a negative or subpar charging experience with the vehicle, even if it might have nothing to do with the vehicle itself. It might just purely be geographic or accessibility. So I think that's really interesting to keep in mind.
No, for sure. You just touched a little bit on tax credits. Overall, after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, have you seen a lot of interest in that and some of the incentives that are?
There's so much uncertainty still that I'm not sure we've seen this huge start of 2023 push. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, we're anticipating some shifts come March, potentially around exactly what will qualify based on battery components and critical mineral that the government has to specify further. So that may play a role. But also, there are very specific MSRP, income requirements, all of these things. It's tough to think of a lot of EVs that really qualify, that are of interest to folks. However, I will say the benefit to Tesla and GM, for instance, has been the removal of the cap. So before Tesla and GM had sold too many EVs, they no longer qualified. Now that cap is gone. I think it was 200,000 vehicles. That's gone. So that certainly helps buyers of those vehicles. And of course, you look at some of the price war that's going on right now, part sparked by Tesla, that's playing a role. So I don't think there's this massive push because even if you do go for the credits, the odds of you getting your hands on that vehicle before March, when more criteria kick in, is a challenge. But there has been, I think, probably some benefit to a few of the automakers, at least in this interim period here.
And no, it's good to hear. And we've seen a tremendous amount of activity in just the broader energy transition after the Inflation Reduction Act got.
Sure. And the used vehicle EV market, I think, is something critical as well. That shouldn't change come March. I think the March changes will apply only to new EVs. So this used credit, that was a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alexa, what's next for you? I know you're a business insider now and you love it. I don't want to make you talk like you're going somewhere else, but where do you see your life taking you as you continue to grow in your career?
I appreciate the question. No, I've been absolutely thrilled with the past year and a half or so with my role at Insider. Largely, I really want to continue to focus on the battery space. I think the mining beat is going to be so fascinating moving forward. And it touches on so many different things, as we've already discussed, not only the auto industry, but the policy behind. Of course, there's geopolitical relations to keep in mind. There's so many stakeholders in mining, especially for auto right now. So personally, that's where I really want to invest more of my reporting resources moving forward, is keeping an eye on the mining space. Human rights, of course, is a priority. And that's number one in that conversation. Equity, all of these things. And especially as to our point earlier about onshoring, as more of this gets in our backyard, so to speak, what will that really mean for communities here in the US, the workforce here in the US? All of that's on my radar. But I'm also very interested to keep following the EV startup space, how these production ramp ups continue to go, and how adoption of startup product continues to go.
No, I think that's a great goal. Mining is a super exciting area, and mining throughout the Americas is a big deal, both in North America and South America, and it has such an impact, as you mentioned. And it is critically important we focus on human rights and that we make sure that we're doing things in an ethical way and that we don't just trade one problem that maybe we have with oil and gas for another problem. So I think we have to learn from the past, but mining is a critical area. I'm very interested in it as well.
Exactly. No, I think that's such an important point, is we're at this stage now with the investments, these production guidances, and all of these goals and all of this excitement. we really have to be proactive on as we onshore the battery supply chain, what that means here in the US for human rights, for communities, for workforces. And I think exactly what you said, we can't just swap out one problem with another. Now is this really critical window of opportunity for automakers and their suppliers and their partners to think thoughtfully about all of this.
I couldn't agree more. Alexa, it's really been a pleasure having you on today. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you about, or anything that you're promoting, articles that you'd like to reference before we go?
Well, I appreciate that, and that's usually the question I like to ask folks at the end of an interview, so you stole a little bit of a page out of my book here, but no, I love to connect with folks on LinkedIn. I usually post all of my coverage there, so I would appreciate a follow or happy to connect, and you'll be able to find more of what I'm writing on a daily basis there. Big on Twitter as well, but a little bit more on LinkedIn these days, so
Very good. I couldn't agree more. LinkedIn is really an exciting space, and love LinkedIn as an emerging social network. So hats off to LinkedIn and Microsoft. Alexa, it's been a pleasure. This has been Alexa St. John, a reporter with Business Insider. She's in Detroit and she covers mobility, startups, EVs, venture capital, and really is a true authority when it comes to EVs. So look her up on LinkedIn and appreciate having you on. Thanks, Alexa.
thank you. Appreciate it.